In the concluding chapter of his famous autobiography, Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American slave written by himself, 1845. Douglass describes the moments in 1841 when he first stepped forward to speak at an anti-slavery convention in Nantucket, Massachusetts. It was a severe cross, he says, and I took it up reluctantly. However reluctant he may have been in the moments following the speech, the 23-year-old fugitive slave felt a degree of freedom, and just as important, realized he had discovered his vocation. As he states at the end of the narrative, from that time until now, I have been engaged in pleading the cause of my brethren. With what success and with what devotion, I leave those acquainted with my labors to decide. Douglass will continue to plead the cause of African Americans for over 50 years. He published 3 versions of his autobiography: the narrative, done in 1845, My Bondage and My Freedom, done in 1855, Life and Times of Frederick Douglass, done in 1881, revised edition in 1892, as well as a novella, The Heroic Slave, done in 1853, and numerous essays and speeches. He also established and edited 3 African American newspapers: the North Star from 1847 to 1851, Frederick Douglass Paper from 1851 to 1859, and Douglass Monthly in 1859 to 1863, and edited a 4th, The New National Era, from 1870 to 1873. By the time of his death, Douglass was thought of in the United States and abroad as the most influential African American leader of the 19th century, as one of the greatest orators of the age, in the manner of Benjamin Franklin, whom he greatly admired. Douglass presented himself as a representative American whose rise to prominence spoke to the promises of the nation's egalitarian ideology. But he also had a clear-eyed understanding of the hurdles that slavery and racism placed in the way of African Americans. Regularly invoking the principles of the Declaration of Independence, Douglass throughout his life challenged the nation to live up to its founding ideals. In the Lessons of the Hour, 1894, one of his final speeches, Douglass condemned the rise of lynching with the passion and vigor of his early writing. Seeing this latest outbreak of violence against black people as a threat to what he had devoted his life to achieving, a multiracial United States offering equal rights and justice for all. Douglass was born into slavery as Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey in February 1818 at Holmes Hill Farm in Talbot County on the eastern shores of Maryland. His mother was Harriet Bailey. His father was a white man whose identity is still not known, although widely assumed to have been his mother's owner, Aaron Anthony. In 1826, about a year after the death of his mother and shortly after the death of Anthony, Douglass became the property of Thomas Auld and was sent to live with Thomas's brother Hugh Auld and his wife Sophia in Baltimore. According to the 1845 narrative, Sophia began to teach Douglass how to read, but Hugh forbade her to continue because he said learning would forever unfit him to be a slave. Nevertheless, as the autobiographies recount, Douglass cleverly found ways to learn how to read and write. During this first residence in Baltimore, Douglass acquired and pored over the Columbian Orator, 1797, a popular school text, finding its many speeches denouncing oppression applicable to his own situation. He read about abolition as an organized movement in the Baltimore American and established a close relationship with the free black Charles Lawson, a lay preacher who became his spiritual mentor and told Douglass that he had been chosen to do great work. In 1833, after 7 years in Baltimore, Douglass was returned to Thomas Auld's plantation, where he quickly became known for his rebellious attitude and was sent to work on the farm of Edward Covey, a specialist in slave breaking. The account of his decline and reawakening at Covey's farm, culminating in a hand-to-hand battle between Covey and Douglass in August 1834, is the turning point of the narrative. Following this confrontation, Douglass took on a greater leadership role among the slaves, conducting a Sabbath school at William Freeland's plantation in 1835, and in 1836 organizing an escape attempt with a group of slaves. For his role in the failed plot, Douglass was briefly jailed in eastern Maryland. He was then returned to the Aulds in Baltimore, where he learned the caulking trade in the shipyards. Though Hugh Auld kept most of the money Frederick earned, Douglass was able to save enough to develop a feasible plan of escape. In this plan, he was helped both financially and emotionally by the free black Anna Murray, to whom he became engaged on September the 3rd, 1838. The very day he boarded a train for New York disguised as a sailor and carrying the borrowed papers of a free black seaman. Douglass withheld information about his mode of escape until the third of his autobiographies, when disclosing it could no longer endanger the lives and plans of other fugitives from Baltimore. Within days of his escape, Anna joined him in New York City, and they were married on September the 15th. They soon left for New Bedford, Massachusetts, where the likelihood of his being captured as a fugitive slave was reduced by his assuming the name Douglass, which he took from Sir Walter Scott's poem, The Lady of the Lake, 1810. Though Douglass in the narrative emphasizes the splendor of New Bedford compared to towns under slavery, life in New Bedford was not easy for the newly married couple. Douglass was discriminated against when he sought work as a caulker and had to piece together a living doing odd jobs. In 1839, he became a licensed preacher in the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church. That same year, the Douglasses' first child, Rosetta, was born. A son, Louis, was born the following year, and the other three Douglass children, Frederick, Charles, and Annie, were born in 1842, 1844, and 1849, respectively. Soon after arriving in New Bedford, Douglass subscribed to the abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison's Liberator. Garrison was in the audience when Douglass delivered his first anti-slavery speech, and shortly thereafter he hired Douglass as a speaker in his Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society. During 1841 through 1843, Douglass delivered his anti-slavery message on behalf of Garrison's organization in a number of northern states, and on occasions in 1843 in Pendleton, Indiana, he was attacked by anti-abolitionist mob and suffered a broken hand. Douglass began work on his narrative in 1844, and it was published in May of 1845 by Garrison's anti-slavery office in Boston. The narrative sold some 30,000 copies in its first 5 years, making it a bona fide bestseller for the time and helping to establish Douglass as an international spokesperson for freedom and equality. Some earlier slave narratives had been ghostwritten or composed with the help of white editors, but the narrative, vivid details, and stylistic distinctiveness combined with the reputation Douglass had earned as an eloquent speaker, left no doubt that Douglass had in fact written his own story in his own words. Garrison's abolitionist principle, a commitment to an immediate end to slavery, an advocacy of moral persuasion over violence, and a belief that the Constitution was a pro-slavery document, inspired Douglass in the early to mid 1840s when he went on an extended speaking tour in Great Britain during 1845 and 46, in part to escape the fugitive slave hunters that he feared would track him down after the publication of the narrative. He spoke as a Garrison abolitionist, but upon his return to the United States as a free man, British anti-slavery friends had purchased his freedom for $711 in 1846. Douglass became increasingly suspicious of Garrison, particularly when Garrison attempted to bully him into shutting down his newspaper, the North Star, which Douglass founded not in New Bedford but in Rochester, New York, where Douglass resettled in part to escape the influence of Garrison. In the inaugural issue of December 3rd, 1847, Douglass declared that in the anti-slavery and anti-racism struggle, African Americans must be our own representatives and advocates, not exclusively but peculiarly, not distinct from but in connection with our white friends. Garrison, who wanted absolute loyalty and control of the movement, began to question Douglass' anti-slavery politics and even published unsubstantiated rumors in the Liberator about Douglass' romantic involvement with Julia Griffith, a white Englishwoman living in the Douglass home and helping him with editorial work on the North Star. But along with the personality clashes, there were ideology differences between the two. By 1851, after forming a friendship with the New York abolitionist Gerrit Smith, Douglass formally broke with Garrison, announcing his belief in a more pragmatic political abolitionism that regarded the Constitution as an anti-slavery document that saw the value in steadily working toward the goals of anti-slavery and that defended the strategic use of black violence as a response to the violence of slavery. In 1855, Douglass published My Bondage and My Freedom, a revised and substantially longer version of his 1845 autobiography. In covering the 10 years of his life since the narrative, Douglass wrote about his encounter with racism in the North, his work as an abolitionist and his break with Garrison. No longer willing to leave the philosophy of abolition to Garrison and other white abolitionists, Douglass asserted his intellectual and interpretive independence, and also his deeper connection to black moral reformers and abolitionists. It is significant that the second autobiography was introduced not by white abolitionists, as with the narrative, but by the black physician and abolitionist James McCune Smith, who celebrated Douglass as a representative American man, a type of his countrymen, like the narrative, My Bondage and My Freedom, was widely read, selling 18,000 copies during its first 2 years. Like all autobiographies, Douglass artistically shaped the facts of his life to underscore the particular truth that he wished to convey at the moment of composition. In the 1845 narrative, he presented himself as a relatively isolated from his fellow slaves, describing his fight with Covey as a heroic instance of individual rebellion. In 1855, My Bondage and My Freedom, he depicted the fight as involving several other African Americans who came to his assistance. Similarly, in 1845, Douglass said little about the role of his mother in his life because he wanted to show his white readers how slavery divided mothers and children. In 1855, he celebrated the influence of his grandmother and mother. This new emphasis on the importance of black culture and family to his developing identity as an anti-slavery leader resonated with the rhetoric of sentiment associated with Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin, 1852, and other works by popular mid-19th century women writers. It testified to Douglass' awareness that women were a powerful force within the abolitionist movement. Stowe's influence can also be felt on Douglass' only work of fiction, the novella, The Heroic Slave, which he published in 1853. In Frederick Douglass' paper and in a fundraising volume for his newspaper, like Stowe, he represented sympathetic bonds between whites and blacks that could lead to united action against enslavers. Unlike Stowe in Uncle Tom's Cabin, he celebrated a dark-skinned man capable of using violence against whites and showed blacks moving south to the Caribbean instead of north to Canada. Following the Supreme Court 1857 ruling in the Dred Scott case, which declared that blacks could never become citizens of the United States, Douglass became more militant in his writing. Though he refused to participate in John Brown's 1859 raid on the Federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry, which he regarded as a suicidal action, he was obligated to flee to Canada and thence to England because of his known association with Brown. He returned in May 1860 after receiving news of the death of his daughter Annie. Once the Civil War began, Douglass took an active role in the campaign to make free black men eligible to serve the Union cause. He became a successful recruiter of black soldiers, whose rank soon included his own son, having helped to enlist these men. Douglass subsequently protested directly to the President Lincoln over blacks' unequal pay and treatment in the Union Army. After the war, Douglass criticized Lincoln's successor over what he believed was a tardy and unjust Reconstruction policy. He was particularly insistent in calling for the swift passage of the Fifth Amendment guaranteeing suffrage to the newly emancipated male slaves. By the 1870s, Douglass was a significant figure in the Republican Party, taking on such positions as president of Freeman's Bank, federal marshal, and recorder of deeds for the District of Columbia. Never satisfied with the grudging legal concession the Civil War yielded, Douglass persistently objected to every sign of discrimination against blacks and others disenfranchised people, including women. At times, his writings seemed to celebrate black manhood, but Douglass had a long-standing interest in women's rights. Though he broke temporarily with women's rights supporters in 1868 and 69 when he championed the 15th Amendment, which failed to offer suffrage to women. He had attended the first women's rights convention in Seneca Falls, New York in 1848. And he continued to attend women's rights conventions and to editorialize and lecture in favor of women's rights. His final speech, delivered just hours before he died of a heart attack on February the 20th, 1895, was at a women's rights rally. Douglass published the third of his autobiographies, Life and Times of Frederick Douglass, in 1881, and he brought out an expanded version in 1892. This last memoir added much to the record of Douglass' post-Civil War years, but did not fare nearly as well in the marketplace as the earlier two autobiographies. Douglass was accused in the black press of betraying his race by marrying his white former secretary, Helen Pitts, in 1884. Anna Douglass had died in 1882, and several years later, when he was the U.S. Consul General to Haiti, he was accused in newspapers and journals of being overly sympathetic to black Haitians when the United States was attempting to gain a naval port in the island nation. In the final version of his life history, Douglass took on his critics and asserted in the strongest possible terms his commitment to a cosmopolitan vision of a world without invidious racial distinction and prejudice. It would be difficult to exaggerate the importance for Americans across the color line of Douglass' exemplary career as a champion of human rights. Frederick Douglass.